The showroom of Westlake Luxury Motors gleamed under the bright halogen lights, each surface polished to a mirror-like shine. Rows of high-end cars, from sleek sedans to roaring sports cars, sat on display like modern art pieces. Every detail of the dealership spoke of wealth and exclusivity: the plush leather chairs in the waiting lounge, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air, and the murmured exchanges between sharply dressed salespeople and their equally well-dressed clients. At the heart of it all stood Brad Cooper, a young and ambitious salesman. With his tailored suit, perfectly styled blonde hair, and a smile that could charm anyone, or so he believed, Brad exuded confidence. He thrived in this environment, where selling cars wasn't just about closing deals but also about projecting status. To him, every customer was either an opportunity or a waste of time. And Brad had no patience for the latter. "Another good day, Brad?" asked Jenna, a fellow salesperson, as she leaned against a desk. Brad smirked, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Closed on the new Apex V12 this morning. That's 3 this week. I'm on fire." Jenna rolled her eyes playfully. "You better hope you can keep up. Kevin's right on your tail for Salesman of the Month." "Kevin can try," Brad replied, glancing at the competition with a dismissive shrug. "But I have the edge. It's all about knowing who's serious and who's wasting your time." As if on cue, the door chimed softly, signaling a new arrival. All heads turned as a man walked in, Walter Henderson, dressed in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt. His boots were scuffed, and his hair was slightly unruly, as though he'd come straight from a construction site. He looked around the showroom with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Brad's confident smile faltered. He exchanged a knowing glance with Jenna, his lips curling into a smirk. "Speaking of time wasters," he murmured under his breath. Walter approached hesitantly, his eyes locking onto a midnight blue sedan near the center of the showroom. Its smooth lines and glossy finish reflected the overhead lights, and he paused for a moment, admiring its craftsmanship. Then, with a deep breath, he walked toward Brad, who stood by a desk scrolling through his tablet. "Excuse me," Walter began, his voice steady but polite. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about that car over there." Brad didn't look up immediately. When he finally did, his smile was thin, forced. "The Imperial LX? Beautiful car, isn't it? Starts at $95,000. That's before tax and additional features." Walter nodded, his hands resting nervously in his pockets. "Yeah, it's stunning. I've been saving up for a while, and I'd like to know." "Sir," Brad interrupted, his tone dripping with polite dismissal. "We don't usually cater to casual inquiries. These vehicles are, well, a bit exclusive." He glanced at Walter's worn clothes, his eyebrows raising ever so slightly. "Perhaps I can recommend something more within reach? There's a used car lot down the street that has great options." A quiet hush fell over the showroom as a few other salespeople glanced in their direction. Walter's expression remained calm, though his shoulders stiffened slightly. "I appreciate the suggestion," Walter replied, his voice steady. "But I'd still like to know more about this one." Brad hesitated. He could sense a small audience forming among his colleagues, their subtle smiles betraying their amusement. Not wanting to back down, Brad gestured toward the car with a flourish. "It's got a 4.5-liter V8 engine, 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds, and every luxury feature you can imagine. Leather interiors, adaptive cruise control, and a state-of-the-art sound system. But as I said, these cars aren't for everyone." He added the last sentence with a pointed look. Walter gave a small nod, taking in the information. "Thank you," he said simply. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps slow but purposeful. As the door closed behind him, Jenna leaned in toward Brad. "Was that necessary?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Brad shrugged, flashing his signature grin. "I just saved him some embarrassment. Trust me, Jenna, not everyone belongs in here." Walter walks out of the dealership and into the quiet streets, reflecting on the interaction. He doesn't let the experience dampen his spirits entirely. Instead, he channels his focus back to his simple life and the work that defines him. As Walter stepped out of the gleaming showroom into the crisp afternoon air, he let out a slow breath. The hum of city traffic filled his ears as he walked toward his truck, an old, battered vehicle that had served him faithfully for over a decade. Its faded paint and dented bumper stood in stark contrast to the pristine luxury cars he had just admired. Yet, Walter didn't feel anger or bitterness about what had happened inside. If anything, he felt a quiet determination rising within him. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the familiar rumble calming his thoughts. "Not today," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel. He glanced one last time at the dealership through his rearview mirror before pulling onto the road. Walter's home was a modest, one-story house on the edge of the city. The lawn was tidy, though a little overgrown in places, and the wooden fence showed signs of age. Pulling into the driveway, Walter parked his truck and grabbed his tool belt from the passenger seat. The weight of it was familiar, almost comforting, as he walked toward the small shed in his backyard. The shed was Walter's sanctuary, a workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and the faint hum of tools. Here, he created beauty out of raw materials, handcrafted furniture, delicate carvings, and intricate designs that spoke of skill and passion. His hands, rough from years of work, moved deftly over a half-finished rocking chair. It was meant for Mrs. Evans, a kind elderly woman who lived 2 streets over. She had asked for something special to commemorate her late husband, and Walter had promised her his best. He worked in silence, the rhythmic sound of sandpaper against wood grounding him. The incident at the dealership replayed in his mind, not with anger, but with curiosity. Was it really so strange for someone like him to dream of owning a car like that? His thoughts drifted to his late father, who had always said, "Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth, Walt. You're the one who decides that." Later that evening, Walter sat on his small porch, a mug of coffee in hand. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As he sipped, he heard the familiar voice of his neighbor, a boy named Ethan, calling out, "Hey, Mr. Henderson. You working on another chair?" Ethan, no older than 10, bounded across the yard, his energy boundless. "That's right," Walter replied with a smile. "This one's special. Want to see it tomorrow?" Ethan nodded eagerly before his mother's voice called him back inside. Walter watched the boy go, his heart warm. Moments like these reminded him of what truly mattered. It wasn't wealth or luxury, it was the connections he built, the lives he touched. The next morning, Walter loaded a finished piece of furniture into his truck and headed to his first delivery. The drive took him to a sprawling suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns and pristine houses lined the streets. Walter had done work here before, always referred by word of mouth. His reputation as an honest, hard-working craftsman had earned him the trust of many. Today's delivery was for Mr. Harold Bishop, a wealthy retiree who had commissioned a custom dining table. As Walter carried the heavy table into the house, Harold watched him with an appraising look. "You've outdone yourself, Walter," Harold said, running a hand over the smooth surface of the table. "This is exquisite." "Thank you, sir," Walter replied, setting the table down carefully. "I'm glad you like it." Harold hesitated for a moment, then gestured for Walter to sit. "You know, Walter, I've seen a lot of people come and go in this business, but you're different. You take pride in your work, and it shows." Walter nodded humbly. "It's just how I was raised. Do the best you can, no matter what." "Well, it's rare these days," Harold said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "You're the kind of man people don't forget." Over the weeks that followed, Walter continued his routine of work and quiet reflection. The memory of the dealership lingered, but it was overshadowed by the joy he found in his craft. Then, one day, a letter arrived in his mailbox that would change everything. The envelope was thick and embossed with gold lettering. Walter turned it over in his hands, puzzled. He opened it carefully and read the contents, his eyes widening as he took in the words. The letter was from a law firm representing Harold Bishop, who had passed away unexpectedly a week prior. In it, Walter learned that Harold had left him a substantial inheritance, a token of gratitude for the kindness and integrity Walter had shown over the years. Walter sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in his hands. Harold's words echoed in his mind, "You're the kind of man people don't forget." Tears welled in his eyes as he realized the magnitude of the gesture. Walter spends the next few days grappling with the news, reflecting on what it means for his life and how he can honor Harold's legacy. He decides that the inheritance is not just a gift, it's an opportunity to fulfill a long-held dream. The letter sat on Walter's kitchen table, its pristine white paper stark against the grain of the wood. He had read it 3 times already, and yet the words felt surreal. An inheritance of $250,000 has been entrusted to you by Mr. Harold Bishop as a testament to your kindness and dedication. Walter leaned back in his chair, his calloused hands resting on his lap. He couldn't shake the mixture of gratitude and disbelief swirling within him. This kind of money was beyond anything he had ever imagined for himself. It wasn't just life-changing, it was a recognition of everything he stood for. That evening, Walter stepped out onto his porch, the envelope clutched loosely in his hand. The sky was painted with hues of twilight, and the air was cool against his skin. As he gazed into the distance, he thought of Harold, the man who had always treated him with respect, no matter how simple his life seemed. "Thank you," Walter murmured softly, his words carried away by the breeze. The next few days passed in a haze of introspection. Walter went about his work as usual, delivering furniture and mending fences for neighbors. But in the quiet moments, his thoughts always returned to Harold's gift. What would he do with it? How could he honor such an incredible gesture? It wasn't long before an idea began to take root, an old dream, one he had almost forgotten. As a boy, Walter had been captivated by the craftsmanship of luxury vehicles. Not for the prestige, but for the engineering, the detail, the artistry. He had often stopped to admire sleek cars parked on the street, wondering how something so beautiful could be made. Over the years, that fascination had faded under the weight of responsibility and practicality. But now, with Harold's gift, it felt like a possibility. Walter's mind drifted back to the Imperial LX, the car he had seen at the dealership. It wasn't just a car, it was a masterpiece. He could still hear the hum of its engine, still picture the way its polished surface caught the light. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream. The decision wasn't made lightly. Walter spent hours poring over his finances, carefully allocating the inheritance to secure his future. He ensured that a significant portion would be invested, another reserved for his workshop, and a small amount set aside for personal use. The car, he decided, would be his reward, a symbol of what he had achieved through hard work and integrity. When the plan was set, Walter felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just buying a car, he was reclaiming a piece of himself that had been buried under years of modest living. It wasn't about proving anything to others, least of all Brad or anyone at the dealership. It was about celebrating the journey that had brought him here. On a crisp Friday morning, Walter stepped into a local clothing store. The rows of neatly pressed shirts and jackets felt foreign, but he moved with quiet determination. After some searching, he found what he was looking for, a tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a pair of polished leather shoes. When he tried them on, he barely recognized himself in the mirror. The transformation was subtle but powerful. "Looking sharp, sir," the store clerk said with a smile as she rang up his purchase. Walter nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you." With his new clothes folded neatly in a bag, he walked back to his truck, his heart steady with anticipation. Tomorrow, he would return to the dealership, not as the man who had been dismissed, but as the man who had earned his place there. The morning of his visit, Walter woke early, the golden light of dawn spilling through his window. He took his time getting ready, savoring each step. When he slipped on the blazer and buttoned the shirt, he felt a quiet confidence settle over him. This wasn't about appearances, it was about stepping into a new chapter of his life. Driving to the dealership, Walter couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. He replayed the scene from his last visit in his mind, the dismissive tone, the the smirks, the way Brad had looked at him. But instead of resentment, he felt a sense of closure. Today wasn't about Brad. It was about honoring Harold's gift and the principles that had guided his life. When Walter pulled into the dealership lot, his old truck stood out starkly among the polished luxury cars. He parked it with care and stepped out, smoothing the front of his Blazer. The showroom loomed before him, its glass walls glinting in the sunlight. As he approached, the automatic doors slid open, and the familiar hum of the dealership greeted him. Inside, salespeople milled about, their sharp suits and confident smiles unchanged. Walter scanned the room until his eyes landed on Brad, who was speaking with a colleague near the front desk. Brad didn't notice Walter at first. He was too busy scrolling through his tablet, his expression as self-assured as ever. But when Walter stepped closer, his presence caught Brad's attention. The younger man's brows furrowed in slight confusion, as if trying to place the face before him. "Good morning," Walter said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to see the Imperial LX." For a moment, Brad said nothing. Then recognition dawned on his face, and his expression shifted, first to surprise, then to something closer to discomfort. Of course," Brad stammered, recovering quickly. His usual confident demeanor seemed to falter as he gestured toward the car. "Right this way, sir." The air inside the dealership felt heavier than Walter remembered, but this time, it didn't intimidate him. His steps were steady as he followed Brad toward the Imperial LX, the very car that had captured his attention on his first visit. Its midnight blue finish gleamed under the showroom lights, even more stunning than Walter had remembered. Brad walked slightly ahead, his usual swagger subdued. It was clear that he recognized Walter, though he made no mention of their earlier encounter. Instead, he forced a professional smile, gesturing toward the car with an exaggerated flourish. "Here we are," Brad said, his voice overly polished. "The Imperial LX. Top-of-the-line luxury, unparalleled performance. You've got excellent taste, sir." Walter nodded, letting his hand brush lightly over the car's smooth surface. He took his time inspecting it, walking around it with a thoughtful expression. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle Brad, who shifted awkwardly beside him. "Would you like to sit inside?" Brad asked, motioning to the driver's seat. "Yes," Walter replied simply, his tone measured. Brad quickly opened the door, stepping aside as Walter slid into the plush leather seat. The interior was immaculate, every detail meticulously crafted. Walter ran his hands over the steering wheel, taking in the faint scent of new leather and the cool touch of the controls beneath his fingers. It felt surreal, almost like stepping into another world. But this time, he didn't feel like an outsider. Brad cleared his throat, pulling Walter's attention back. "This model comes fully loaded. Heated seats, adaptive suspension, integrated navigation, it's the pinnacle of comfort and performance." Walter looked up at him, his eyes calm but sharp. "I remember. You mentioned all of this last time." Brad froze for a moment, the weight of Walter's words sinking in. His forced smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of embarrassment. Yes, I may have. Well, as I said, it's an exceptional vehicle." Walter didn't press the point. He wasn't here to make Brad squirm, at least, not intentionally. Instead, he leaned back in the seat, letting himself imagine the possibilities. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to indulge in the dream. After a few moments, Walter stepped out of the car, straightening his Blazer. "I'll take it," he said calmly. Brad blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "You'll take it?" "Yes," Walter replied, meeting Brad's gaze directly. "But I have a condition." Brad hesitated, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Of course. What's the condition?" "I want the full experience," Walter said, his voice steady. "The respect and attention that every customer deserves, regardless of how they look when they walk through that door." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Brad's face reddened slightly, but he nodded. "Absolutely, sir. I'll take care of everything personally." Walter gave a small nod of approval. Good. The next hour was a whirlwind of paperwork and formalities. Brad worked diligently, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet professionalism. Walter observed him carefully, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor. It wasn't just embarrassment, there was a genuine effort to make amends, though Brad seemed unsure of how to articulate it. As they neared the end of the process, Brad hesitated before handing Walter the final set of documents. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his tone more subdued. I owe you an apology." Walter looked up, his expression unreadable. "I didn't treat you with the respect you deserved the first time you came here," Brad continued, his voice steady but contrite. "I made assumptions based on appearances, and that was wrong. You've shown me that I need to do better. So, I'm sorry." For a moment, the two men stood in silence. Then Walter extended his hand, his grip firm but kind. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Brad nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. There was still a hint of shame in his expression, but also a glimmer of relief. It was clear that Walter's forgiveness carried more weight than Brad had expected. With the paperwork complete, Walter was handed the keys to his new car. The moment felt surreal as he stepped into the driver's seat, the engine purring softly as he started it. Brad stood nearby, watching as Walter adjusted the mirrors and fastened his seatbelt. "Enjoy the ride, Mr. Henderson," Brad said, his tone genuine. Walter looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I will. And thank you." As the car glided out of the showroom and onto the open road, Walter felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The Imperial LX wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for, a reminder of the values that had guided him through life. And as he drove, the wind rushing past the open windows, he couldn't help but think of Harold Bishop and the gift that had made it all possible. The Imperial LX glided effortlessly over the smooth asphalt, its engine humming with a low, powerful purr. Behind the wheel, Walter couldn't help but marvel at the car's precision. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a masterpiece, a perfect blend of engineering and art. Every turn of the wheel, every gentle press of the accelerator, reminded him of why he had fallen in love with the design in the first place. But as he drove toward the dealership for his final visit, Walter wasn't focused on the car. Instead, his mind lingered on Brad and the quiet apology he had offered during the sale. It had been genuine, Walter was certain of that. Still, he wondered if Brad truly understood the lesson, if this encounter would leave a lasting impact or simply fade as another transaction. When Walter arrived at the dealership, the familiar gleam of the showroom windows reflected in the car's polished exterior. This time, he wasn't here to finalize paperwork or take delivery of his purchase. He had a different purpose. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed a small group of salespeople chatting near the entrance. One of them noticed Walter and gave him a polite nod, but Brad was nowhere in sight. Adjusting his blazer, Walter walked through the automatic doors, his presence immediately drawing attention. "Mr. Henderson," Jenna greeted him warmly, stepping forward with a professional smile. "Back so soon? Is everything with the car to your satisfaction?" Walter returned her smile. "The car's perfect, Jenna. I'm here to see Brad. Is he available?" Jenna hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering toward the back of the showroom. "He's in the office. Let me get him for you." As Jenna disappeared behind a glass partition, Walter took a moment to look around. The dealership was the same as he remembered, polished floors, luxurious displays, and the hum of soft conversation. But the way the staff looked at him now was different. There was no dismissive glances, no quiet judgment. Instead, there was a sense of respect, of acknowledgement. Brad emerged from the office a moment later, his expression cautiously neutral. He approached Walter with a slight nod, his demeanor more subdued than usual. "Mr. Henderson," Brad began, his voice steady but lacking the bravado it once held. "What can I do for you?" Walter gestured toward a nearby lounge area. "I'd like to talk, if you have a moment." Brad hesitated, then nodded. Of course. The two men sat down in the plush chairs, the hum of the showroom a faint backdrop. For a moment, Walter didn't speak, his eyes scanning the dealership floor. Brad shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Walter to begin. I wanted to thank you, Walter said finally, his tone calm. Not just for selling me the car, but for taking the time to apologize. That meant something to me. Brad's posture relaxed slightly, though a hint of tension remained in his expression. I'm glad to hear that. I meant every word. Walter nodded, his gaze steady. I believe you did. But I have to ask, why did it take so long? What was it about me that made you think I wasn't worth your time the first time I walked through those doors? Brad's face flushed, and he looked down at his hands. I don't know, he admitted after a moment. I guess I just assumed, based on how you looked, that you weren't serious. That you didn't belong here. He glanced up, his eyes meeting Walter's. It was wrong of me, and I've been thinking about it a lot since that day. I don't want to be that kind of person. Walter leaned back in his chair, considering Brad's words. There was sincerity in his tone, a genuine desire to change. You're young, Brad, Walter said, his voice gentle. You've got plenty of time to learn. But let me tell you something I've learned in my years, every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect, no matter what they look like or where they come from. You never know what someone's story might be. Brad nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right, he said quietly. I've been so focused on closing deals and chasing numbers that I forgot what really matters. I don't want to be that kind of salesman, or that kind of person. Walter gave him a small smile. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong. That's the first step. The next step is making sure you don't repeat the same mistake. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of the dealership's door opening. A man in his late 50s walked in, his clothes simple and worn but clean. He looked around the showroom with quiet interest, his gaze lingering on a bright red sports car near the entrance. Brad glanced at the man, then back at Walter. There was a moment of hesitation, and then Brad stood, straightening his tie. Excuse me, he said, his voice steady. I think I have a customer to help. Walter watched as Brad approached the man, his posture open and welcoming. He extended a hand and introduced himself, engaging the man in friendly conversation. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes. A sense of quiet satisfaction settled over Walter as he rose from his seat. He had done what he came to do, not just to buy a car, but to leave a mark, to share a lesson that might ripple beyond this one interaction. As Walter stepped outside, the Imperial LX gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, a symbol of his journey. But it wasn't the car that gave him pride. It was the knowledge that he had stayed true to his values, even in the face of judgment. And perhaps, in doing so, he had helped someone else see the world a little differently. The drive home felt different this time. The Imperial LX hummed softly beneath Walter, its engine a soothing rhythm. The car handled every curve of the road with precision, the leather seat cradling him in comfort. Yet, as perfect as the car was, it wasn't what occupied Walter's thoughts. Instead, his mind lingered on the encounter with Brad. Walter replayed their conversation, Brad's discomfort giving way to sincerity and then to action. He could see the younger man making an effort, stepping outside his pride and arrogance to connect with a potential customer who might once have been dismissed. It was a small step, but for Walter, it was significant. Growth didn't happen overnight, after all. It came from moments like these, moments of humility, accountability, and understanding. When Walter arrived home, the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the yard. He parked the car carefully in the driveway and stepped out, the cool evening air brushing against his face. Standing there for a moment, he looked back at the car, its sleek design reflecting the fading light. A wave of gratitude washed over him, not just for the car, but for the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Harold Bishop, the man who had believed in him and left him a gift that carried far more than monetary value. Harold's generosity had reminded Walter of his own worth, reaffirming the principles that had guided him through life. It was a legacy Walter would honor, not by flaunting his newfound wealth, but by continuing to live with humility and integrity. As Walter walked up the steps to his porch, a voice called out from across the yard. "Mr. Henderson." It was Ethan, the boy from next door. He bounded over, his face lit with excitement. "Is that your new car? It's amazing." Walter smiled, gesturing for Ethan to come closer. "It is, Ethan. Want to take a look inside?" The boy's eyes widened, and he nodded eagerly. Walter opened the driver's side door, letting Ethan climb into the seat. The boy's hands roamed over the steering wheel and the controls, his enthusiasm infectious. "One day," Ethan said, his voice filled with determination, "I'm going to have a car like this." Walter chuckled softly. "You can have anything you work hard for, Ethan. Just remember, it's not about the car. It's about the kind of person you are, no matter what you drive." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if the words carried a weight he understood. After a few more minutes of exploring the car, the boy ran back to his house, waving as he disappeared inside. The days that followed were quiet but fulfilling. Walter returned to his workshop, resuming the projects that brought him peace. The Imperial LX became a part of his life, not as a status symbol, but as a reminder of the opportunities hard work and kindness could bring. But Walter's story wasn't just about him anymore. Across town, at Westlake Luxury Motors, Brad was beginning his own journey of transformation. Brad stood at his desk, staring at the sales board mounted on the wall. His name was there, prominently displayed near the top, but for the first time, it didn't matter as much. He thought about Walter, the man he had dismissed so easily, the man who had shown him more grace than he deserved. The encounter with Walter had shaken something loose in Brad. It wasn't just guilt, it was a realization that his priorities had been skewed. For years, he had measured success by numbers, how many cars he sold, how much commission he earned. But what about the people behind those numbers? What kind of connections had he been missing by focusing solely on the sale? Brad sighed, running a hand through his hair. Across the showroom, Jenna approached, her expression curious. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "Everything okay?" Brad hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just thinking about things." "Like what?" Jenna pressed, leaning against his desk. Brad glanced at her, then looked away. "About how I've been doing this job all wrong. There's more to it than closing deals, you know? I don't want to be the guy who makes people feel like they don't belong." Jenna tilted her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Well, you're off to a good start. I saw how you handled that customer the other day. You were different. In a good way." Brad met her eyes, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. I'm trying." That evening, as Brad drove home, he couldn't stop thinking about Walter's words. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." The sentence played over and over in his mind, like a mantra. He realized he didn't just want to be a better salesman, he wanted to be a better person. The next morning, Brad arrived at the dealership early, long before the first customers arrived. He sat at his desk and wrote out a list of small goals, things he could do to change his approach. Greet every customer with respect. Listen more than you speak. Focus on building relationships, not just closing deals. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Meanwhile, back in his workshop, Walter finished the final touches on a special project, a handcrafted table dedicated to Harold Bishop's memory. It was simple but elegant, with Harold's name carefully etched into the wood. Walter planned to deliver it to Harold's family as a token of gratitude, a way to honor the man who had believed in him. As Walter loaded the table into his truck, he felt a sense of closure settling over him. The chapter that had begun with a humiliating encounter at the dealership was ending with lessons learned and connections strengthened. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Walter knew he would continue to walk it with integrity and grace. Walter pulled into the Bishop family's driveway on a bright Saturday morning, the carefully crafted table secured in the back of his truck. The house was large and stately, with neatly trimmed hedges and an air of quiet elegance. As he parked and stepped out, a woman in her 60s opened the front door, her warm smile a reflection of the man Walter had known. "Mr. Henderson," she greeted, stepping onto the porch. "I'm Ellen Bishop. Harold spoke of you often." Walter nodded, a mix of humility and gratitude in his expression. "Mrs. Bishop, it's an honor to meet you. Your husband was a remarkable man." Ellen's smile softened. "He thought very highly of you. Please, come inside." Walter followed her into the house, carrying the table with care. The interior was as refined as the exterior, filled with bookshelves, art, and memories of a life well lived. Ellen led him to a sitting room, where he set the table down and stepped back. "This is for you," Walter said. "It's a small way of saying thank you for everything Harold did for me. I wouldn't be where I am today without him." Ellen ran her fingers over the smooth wood, her eyes misting as she read Harold's name etched into the surface. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "He would have loved this." Walter stayed for tea, sharing stories of Harold and the kindness he had shown. As he left, Ellen pressed his hand warmly, her gratitude clear. "You've honored him in the best way possible," she said. "Thank you." Driving away, Walter felt a sense of peace. Harold's gift had changed his life, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the lesson it carried, to live with integrity and to lift others whenever possible. Back at Westlake Luxury Motors, Brad was embracing his own transformation. The changes he had begun after his encounter with Walter were starting to show, not just in his work, but in how his colleagues viewed him. Customers who might once have been dismissed found a welcoming face in Brad, and his newfound sincerity was earning him praise. One afternoon, a man and his teenage son walked into the dealership, their clothes plain but neat. Brad approached them with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Westlake Luxury Motors. How can I help you today?" The man hesitated, glancing at his son. "We're just looking," he said. "My boy's been dreaming about these cars, so I thought I'd bring him to see them up close." Brad crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eager gaze. "Dreams are a great place to start," he said. "Let me show you around." He led them through the showroom, answering the boys' endless questions with patience and enthusiasm. When they left, Brad felt a quiet pride, not for a deal closed, but for a connection made. One evening, Jenna found Brad standing by the sales board, his name still near the top. She nudged him playfully. "So, you've gone soft, huh?" Brad chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe. But I'm still closing deals, so I must be doing something right." Jenna studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're different these days. It's a good look on you." Brad's smile was genuine. He knew he wasn't perfect, no one was, but he was trying, and that was what mattered. As the weeks turned into months, Walter settled back into his life, the Imperial LX becoming a regular feature in his small town. But it wasn't the car that people talked about, it was Walter's humility, his kindness, and the way he treated everyone with respect. One day, as he worked in his shed, a knock sounded at the door. He opened it to find Brad standing there, looking slightly sheepish but determined. "Mr. Henderson," Brad began, extending a hand. "I just wanted to thank you again. For the car, sure, but more for what you taught me. I've been trying to do better." Walter shook his hand firmly, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I can see that, Brad. And call me Walter." Brad nodded, his shoulders relaxing. "Walter. I just wanted you to know, it made a difference." "Good," Walter said. "Because that's what life's about, isn't it? Making a difference." That evening, Walter sat on his porch, the Imperial LX parked in the driveway behind him. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and purple. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about the twists and turns his life had taken. He had faced judgment and adversity, but he had never wavered in his belief in kindness and hard work. And now, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Walter knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new opportunities to grow and to help others do the same. But no matter where the road led, he would walk it with integrity, grace, and a heart full of gratitude.